There we go.
Fantastic. Right. So we are extremely excited to have Dr. Samantha Curle with us today. She's primarily based at the University of Bath, where she is a reader in education with a focus on applied linguistics. But she is also an adjunct professor at Kazar University in Azerbaijan and an associate member of the English Medium Instruction Oxford Research Group. Her research interest lies in the factors affecting academic achievement in EMI in higher education, such as English proficiency and psychological constructs. She's also a very prolific author, having edited 7 books on EMI, 4 of which are forthcoming. And she's also led a global comparative EMI report for the British Council. So her research really has covered EMI in so many different contexts, essentially in 4 of the continents out of 5. So without further ado, I'm very happy to give the floor to Samantha.
Great. Thank you very much, Beatrice, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the British Association of Applied Linguistics English Medium Instruction Special Interest Group, the BAL EMI SIG, for the invitation today to take part in this series of lectures. I'm delighted to be here, so thank you so much. So you should be able to see my slides. I hope that's all well. And in today's talk, I really kind of wanted to unpack and think critically about achievement in English medium instruction research. And I'll focus specifically on assessment, epistemic access, as well as the challenges posed by generative artificial intelligence. And I think the central concern running through the talk is how we currently understand achievement in EMI research, and how that understanding is shaped not just by the students, so it's not an individual issue, but the assessment systems as well as institutional design. So the question to start off with is, why does achievement in EMI research need rethinking? EMI research has tended to equate achievement with 3 main indicators, the first of which is English language proficiency, which is often treated as a primary indicator of how successful students might be in their EMI studies. And the logic being, the more proficient students are in English, the more successful they'll be in their EMI studies. The second is course grades or grade point average, GPA scores, which are assumed to reflect learning outcomes. And the third is language as a proxy, where linguistic ability is substituted for actual learning. And this framing has influenced both research design as well as institutional practice, such as language proficiency is frequently used as a proxy indicator of educational success. Now, the key concern there is that achievement is really theorized as an outcome of educational design. Instead, it's treated as an inherent student attribute at an individual student level, and it's disconnected from the systems and practices that actually produce that outcome. So what does it look like in terms of practice? In EMI research, there are 4 dominant ways that achievement is operationalized. The first is sort of standardized English language tests, such as IELTS, TOEFL. There's also Duolingo, etc. And these are used both as gatekeeping mechanisms to access EMI study, as well as indicators of likely success. The second is entry language thresholds, where minimum scores are assumed to predict academic readiness. So the more proficient students are, the more ready they are perceived to be able to study academic content through English. The third is end of course grades, so the GPA score, a measure of how much academic content has been acquired, mastered, learned, and that's often treated as an objective measure of language achievement. And if we cannot really access the actual end of course grades or students' actual English language test scores, often in research we have self-reported measures and that is often used in a questionnaire where we ask participants to give their self-reported measure of success. And students need to self-report their GPAs or language scores. And it's more a measure of their perceptions of their achievement. And this is often conflated with language confidence. So students may or may not actually be giving a correct estimation of their proficiency. They may not be very confident in how proficient they are and actually self-report a lower grade than they're actually getting. So this is something that we need to be aware of, is that the self-reported measures are quite often used in EMI research. So underlying all of these approaches is a shared assumption that the higher the English proficiency, the higher students will score on their content language tests. So the more proficient students are, this leads to better academic achievement. And the issue is that achievements often operationalized through language-based proxies. So proficiency ends up doing the explanatory work by default. And this is a critical limitation in EMI research, in that this assumption is often tested indirectly rather than examined critically in relation to assessment design and disciplinary learning. So why does this matter? One consequence is the over-attribution to language ability. Success or failure is excessively attributed to student language ability, while other factors such as their prior knowledge, their learning strategies, or even their socioeconomic context remain backgrounded and not foregrounded in the research. At the same time, there's an under-examination of systemic factors, in particular assessment design. So how assessment tasks are constructed, what are they actually measuring, curriculum alignment. So there's very rarely, if ever, an examination of, what are we actually testing? That assessment, does it actually line up with the learning outcomes of the course that the students have just completed in EMI? Do the learning outcomes of the course match the assessment design or demands of that assessment? So we usually just take the GPA without really thinking about these things. And then institutional language policies. So often institutions may not even have a language policy. And how do these linguistic policies shape teaching and learning practices if such a policy exists? So this leads to a risk of deficit positioning, where multilingual students might be positioned as lacking rather than differently resourced. And that perpetuates harmful stereotypes which ignore the rich linguistic and cultural capital that these students bring to academic contexts, EMI academic contexts. So EMI achievement, therefore, is not neutral. And I think this really needs to be emphasized in the literature and thought about and critically and explicitly stated in our studies. How achievement is framed directly influences whether responsibility for outcomes is attributed to the individual students or to the institutions. And when achievement is interpreted primarily through language proficiency, explanations of success or difficulty often focus on the individual student and less attention is paid to the assessment design and institutional practice. So, pardon me, what do we actually mean by achievement in EMI research? There is definitely a need for conceptual clarity. The key distinction when we talk about language proficiency, we're talking about students' ability to speak, read, write, listen to English. But in EMI higher education, it's often only written English that is relied on in EMI higher education. Written essays, for example, prose-based assessment. So it's really kind of focusing only on written English. And this is not really the same as academic achievement, which is understood as the demonstration of academic content mastery or learning. and the intertwining of students being able to be proficient in English, written English specifically, to be able to express those ideas through English of what they have learned in terms of academic content. That is sort of the juxtaposition that we're sitting in at the moment. When we talk about academic achievement, we're not only talking about the mastery of content. We need to kind of connect three different components. So the first is disciplinary knowledge, and that's the ability to build, connect, demonstrate, apply subject-specific knowledge in meaningful ways. The second is epistemic participation, so being able to actively take part in knowledge building within a certain discipline and within the academic conversations of that discipline. And the third is performance under assessment, so the ability to show or demonstrate what you know within particular conditions and constraints of assessment tasks. So if there are specific time frames that students are given to complete and write an essay in terms of the assessment, that will then be a particular condition under which the assessment is taken. So the problem in EMI research is that these constructs are often collapsed or totally not even addressed at all, in fact. And this really weakens the validity of our research findings. So how does this conceptual problem actually play out in research practice? What we often see is a very familiar pattern. Language outcomes are measured, usually proficiency test or self-reported ability. And the problem here is not that language is irrelevant to learning, but that we often infer achievement from language measures without really assessing the assessment design. And just independently sort of looking at linguistic performance. So content academic achievements, or how much academic content students have mastered, might also be inferred from these language-based measures. And I think if a lot of us are in EMI context, we face this issue of reading an essay and sort of thinking, does the student understand the content? But is it simply because they don't have the language to express themselves and demonstrate their content learning? And so this is, where we are kind of stuck between, are we assessing language or content knowledge, and how the two are intertwined. The assessment practices themselves in EMI research remain largely uninterrogated. Which means that the mechanism producing this achievement in EMI research is very much still invisible. Methodologically, this creates two problems. First, construct validity is weakened because what we claim to measure does not align with what is actually assessed or measured. Second, our research findings are vulnerable to overgeneralization because claims about achievement are not fully supported by the evidence. So from a validity perspective, when language proficiency and learning outcomes are analytically separated, assessment performance may reflect language ability rather than disciplinary understanding. So students who are very proficient in the language might be perceived to be understanding more of the discipline than they actually really do. And this introduces construct irrelevant variance in our achievement measures. So if achievement is being inferred rather than examined, what exactly are we missing? So the missing piece is assessment. Assessment is not just a neutral measurement tool. It actively shapes what counts as knowledge, how success is demonstrated, and who is recognized as competent. In EMI contexts, two issues stand out. So first, the linguistic demands are often implicit, so students must navigate unstated language expectations. And the second is disciplinary criteria. and language criteria are rarely separated in EMI assessment. So this makes it difficult to know what is actually being assessed. So this creates what I refer to as an assessment gap. Without examining assessment directly, we cannot really understand how achievement is produced or whether our measures are valid. So once we focus on assessment, a key validity issue becomes impossible to ignore, and that's construct irrelevant variance. So construct irrelevant variance occurs when assessment performance reflects things that we did not intend to assess. In EMI contexts, language proficiency can be inferred in two ways. It can shape how students demonstrate their disciplinary understanding, and it can shape how we interpret assessment outcomes. And the implication is quite stark. Achievement measures must not actually be measuring achievement at all, but instead they reflect a blend of subject knowledge and their ability to express that knowledge in English. So this is where assessment becomes an equity issue. Linguistic complexity varies across disciplines, as we know, and assessment tasks vary across disciplines as well. So this creates unequal challenges within EMI contexts. And there's often a gap between understanding and displaying that knowledge of understanding how much knowledge is understood, where students understand the content but struggle to show that understanding because of the linguistic demands being put on them and the linguistic conditions under which they're working. So as a result, assessment outcomes may reflect access, so opportunity to demonstrate this understanding, rather than the ability, which is the actual competence, their actual understanding of academic content. So the key point here is that inequity is often produced structurally and not individually. And this is really important to remember, as we always kind of put it on the student to be the one to produce the good grade, the good GPA, or have a good language proficiency score. And the problem lies less with students and more with the assessment systems that EMI contexts are adopting. And these assessment systems fail to account for linguistic diversity. So to understand why this matters, I think it's important to think of it in terms of epistemic access. So epistemic access refers to opportunities to engage in knowledge building, to participate legitimately in academic practices, and to be recognized as a knower of knowledge, somebody who knows knowledge, right? In EMI context, language mediates access to all of these opportunities. The medium of instruction becomes a gatekeeper, and this can therefore limit full participation in academic life for some students. So once we think of it in these terms, responsibility of achievement starts to look very different. Achievement is shaped by institutional factors, including curriculum design, staff assessment literacy, which is really important and often overlooked, as well as language policy. And a lot of EMI institutions may not have an explicit language policy in terms of English medium instruction, how much English, is there assessment in English, are the materials in English? These are the types of questions we've been looking at in EMI research for the past decade. So, but even now, after 15 years of the area of research exploding, EMI institutions or programs still don't really have explicit language policies. So if we look at the responsibility of achievement rather than it being an individual student, the responsibility of the individual student, this really kind of reframes failure So instead of seeing failure as an individual deficit, we understand it as an institutional design issue. And that shift is important and has huge implications for policy practice as well as how resources are allocated. And to add to that complexity, we now have generative artificial intelligence, which totally changes the discussion in terms of now we have generative AI, and with a lot of higher education programs still adopting assessment which is prose-based, we are really needing to rethink how we assess in higher education, whether that's English medium instruction or any medium instruction. If you have prose-based assessment, generative AI is going to cause a lot of challenges there in terms of, has this essay been produced by the student or by some kind of generative AI tool? There definitely has been a rapid uptake of generative AI in higher education, and this has prompted renewed scrutiny of our assessment practices as well as academic integrity. AI blurs the boundaries between language support, learning, as well as authorship. And EMI is especially exposed because achievement has historically been assessed through text-heavy, language-focused tasks, and this is where AI is very powerful in terms of assistance. But we want to be talking about assistance rather than sort of replacing knowledge and learning of the students, obviously. So what are the risks if assessment practices remain unchanged in EMI higher education? Firstly, AI can reinforce surface performance. So where polished language kind of masks shallow academic content understanding. So even though it could be a beautifully written essay, the actual understanding of content knowledge may not be there. Second, it can mask structural inequities, so making existing problems harder to see. Third, it can preserve flawed assessment regimes as institutions respond defensively rather than actually redesigning their assessment. So the central concern is that artificial intelligence may stabilize poor assessment practices rather than disrupt them. So all of this brings us to a basic validity question. Authorship, with AI becomes harder to determine. A lot of assessment is product focused. So this product focused assessment really loses its meaning. And traditional plagiarism frameworks are no longer sufficient. So the question is deliberately simple but fundamental. What exactly are we assessing? So without it being doom and gloom, there are opportunities for assessment redesign. So the good news is that AI also creates opportunities. It makes visible our over-reliance on written products, output of product-based assessment, and demonstrates, can highlight a weak alignment between learning outcomes and assessment. So this opens up space for change, and I think we all welcome that, including process-oriented assessment rather than product-oriented assessment, going back to the traditional sort of viva or oral defense. Collaborative tasks among students could also be another option. And moving towards a stronger focus on reasoning rather than just linguistic polish. So perfect English, perfectly produced essay, moving away from that and moving towards measuring critical thinking or reasoning. So these approaches are all well supported in assessment research and offer more suitable ways of evidencing learning. So bringing these strands together, achievements in EMI needs to be reconceptualized It should be understood as a designed outcome produced through assessment systems and as a shared institutional responsibility. It's not simply an individual learner attribute, and it's not just a function of English proficiency. And this reframes and shifts attention away from measuring students to examining and looking at educational systems in a critical way. So what does this all mean for EMI research? I think a lot of us here are EMI researchers and wondering, well, what does that mean for my life, Samantha? Well, first of all, this is really something that I've been trying to emphasize in recent publications is clearer theorization. And this is, not only about assessment, but in a lot of EMI research is the theorization. And so it calls for clearer theorization of achievement, stronger alignment between constructs and measures, explicit analysis of assessment practices, and greater attention to institutional context. So the research gap is clear there. If anything, making that clearer in our publications, I think, would be helpful. But EMI assessment and what's happening in terms of EMI assessment really remains under-researched in the EMI literature. What are the implications if we have practitioners on the line? What are the implications for EMI practice? Assessment needs to be treated as a key site of equity. So that includes responsible integration of generative AI, but also staff development in assessment literacy, as well as recognizing that achievement is a shared institutional responsibility and not just focusing on the students as individuals. So I'd like to end today's talk with the central claim, which is achievement in EMI is produced, not simply just discovered. And so the question I'd like to leave with you to think about is, what would achievement look like if EMI assessment were designed for multilingual knowledge-making individuals rather than adopting monolingual norms? So I think I'll stop there for the moment, and we're going to move to Q&A. Thank you so much for paying attention for this long. I do have some thoughtful questions here at the end, which you can take a screenshot and, all of us to sort of go back and be more reflective about our research in terms of EMI achievement and assessment. And I do hope that that's useful for you. And I hope that this particularly resonated with you in your EMI context. So thank you so much. And I'll stop it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for such a reflective and sophisticated talk. Many important questions were raised, and I'm sure that I've noticed that someone has already gotten started in the chat. But while everybody else keeps thinking about it, perhaps, Alex, you can take a look at the chat and see what's going on there.
Absolutely. Before I do, I'll stop the recording so that everybody feels comfortable participating in the Q&A.